On the day he disappeared, Daniel Carter left behind one final voicemail. It lasted only 23 seconds. 23 ordinary seconds. 23 seconds that sounded so normal, so routine, and so completely unremarkable that investigators initially paid almost no attention to it. Years later, people would listen to that same recording and wonder how they missed it, how they failed to hear what was hiding inside it, how the answer could have existed in plain sight while everyone searched somewhere else. Because what happened to Daniel Carter would become one of those stories that refuses to leave you. The kind of story people think about long after it ends. The kind of story that changes the way you look at ordinary moments. And the kind of story that forces you to ask a difficult question. What if the most important clue isn't the one you're looking for? What if it's the one you've already seen? Or in this case, the one you've already heard? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first, Daniel Carter's disappearance seemed straightforward. Concerning, certainly, but straightforward. Daniel was 51 years old, a respected mechanic, a father, and a familiar face in a small American town where people measured time by routines rather than headlines. He wasn't known for reckless decisions. He wasn't known for conflict. He wasn't the type of person who simply walked away from his life. That's why the voicemail felt reassuring when family members first heard it. The message didn't sound frightened. It didn't sound rushed. It didn't sound like someone experiencing a crisis. If anything, it sounded ordinary. And that's exactly why nobody understood its importance. When Daniel failed to return home, family members assumed there had to be a reasonable explanation. A delay, a misunderstanding, a forgotten obligation, something temporary, something simple. But hours became days, days became weeks, and weeks became months. Soon, the questions began replacing the explanations. Where was Daniel Carter? Why had he vanished without warning? And why was there no trace of what happened after those final 23 seconds? As investigators searched for answers, the voicemail remained in the background. Always present, rarely discussed. People replayed it repeatedly, hoping to hear something obvious. A hidden confession, a warning, a name, a location, anything. But the recording seemed to offer nothing. Just ordinary words spoken by a man nobody expected to disappear. Yet every mystery has a moment where everything changes. A moment where people stop looking at evidence and start understanding it. For Daniel Carter's family, that moment would come years later. And when it did, the realization was devastating. Because the truth wasn't hidden in some secret document. It wasn't locked inside an abandoned building. It wasn't buried beneath layers of complicated evidence. It was sitting inside a recording everyone had already heard dozens of times. The answer was there from the beginning. Not hidden, not concealed, simply overlooked. That's what makes this story unforgettable. Not the disappearance itself, not the investigation, not even the mystery. What makes it unforgettable is the realization that the clue capable of changing everything existed from the very first day. People heard it. Investigators heard it. Family members heard it. Nobody understood it. At least not until it was far too late. And once the truth finally emerged, those 23 seconds would never sound ordinary again. Because hidden inside Daniel Carter's final voicemail was a detail that would eventually explain everything. The question is this. If the answer was there all along, why did nobody hear it? And what exactly was hidden inside a voicemail everyone had already heard? At first, this looked like a simple missing person case. A respected father disappears. A worried family reports him missing. Investigators begin searching for answers. Cases like that happen every year across America. Most eventually find an explanation. Some end happily, others don't. But few remain unanswered for as long as Daniel Carter's disappearance. And even fewer contain a clue that people listen to repeatedly without realizing its importance. To understand why this case became so memorable, you first need to understand the people at the center of it. Daniel Carter was 51 years old. For more than 2 decades, he had worked as a mechanic in the same town. People trusted him. Customers requested him by name. Neighbors described him as dependable. Friends described him as the kind of person who always showed up when someone needed help. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't famous. He wasn't controversial. He was simply respected. The type of man whose routine rarely changed and whose absence would immediately be noticed. Which is exactly what happened. When Daniel failed to appear where he was expected, concern spread quickly. Because disappearing without explanation wasn't something Daniel Carter did. Then there was Olivia Carter, Daniel's daughter. If Daniel represented stability, Olivia represented determination. The two had always been close. Friends and family often spoke about the bond they shared. When others began accepting uncertainty, Olivia refused. When theories emerged, she questioned them. When investigators exhausted one lead, she searched for another. She refused to believe that her father's story could simply end with unanswered questions. Years later, many people would credit Olivia's persistence for keeping the case alive when others were ready to move on. Because while memories fade and public attention shifts elsewhere, Olivia continued searching, continued asking questions, continued listening. Then there was Detective Samuel Reed, the lead investigator assigned to the case. Experienced, methodical, respected. At the beginning, Detective Samuel Reed approached the disappearance the same way many investigators would. Based on the available evidence, he believed there was a reasonable possibility Daniel had left voluntarily. There was no obvious crime scene, no immediate signs of violence, no clear evidence suggesting something catastrophic had occurred. The facts seemed incomplete, but they weren't alarming enough to point investigators toward one specific conclusion. At least not yet. And that assumption would influence the investigation for far longer than anyone realized. Because while Detective Samuel Reed focused on one possibility, another explanation remained hidden in plain sight. Not hidden because someone concealed it. Hidden because nobody understood what they were hearing. Which brings us to the three questions that would eventually define this entire case. Why did Daniel Carter disappear? What did his final voicemail really mean? And why did nobody understand it for years? Those questions sound simple, but the answers would prove far more complicated than anyone expected. Because every person connected to this case heard the voicemail. Family members heard it. Friends heard it. Investigators heard it. Reporters heard it. Experts heard it. And despite all those ears listening carefully, the most important details somehow remained unnoticed. Looking back now, it's tempting to believe the clue should have been obvious. But hindsight has a way of making mysteries seem easier than they actually were. At the time, nobody knew what mattered. Nobody knew what to focus on. Nobody knew that the answer had already arrived. The voicemail wasn't treated as a breakthrough. It wasn't treated as a warning. It wasn't even treated as particularly important. It was simply another piece of information in a growing investigation. Another recording. Another lead. Another possibility. Nothing more. Or so everyone believed. Because what Detective Samuel Reed, Olivia Carter, and everyone else failed to realize was that the voicemail wasn't merely part of the story. It was the story. The answer had been sitting there from the beginning. Waiting. Patiently. Inside 23 ordinary seconds that nobody thought mattered. And it all started with a voicemail nobody thought mattered. For decades, Daniel Carter lived a life built on routine. The kind of routine most people never think about because it feels permanent. Every morning followed a familiar pattern. He woke up early, grabbed coffee from the same diner several blocks from his home, exchanged greetings with people he had known for years, and arrived at the repair shop before most of the town had fully started its day. Customers trusted him because he was honest. Friends trusted him because he was dependable. Family trusted him because he had given them every reason to. If someone in town needed help repairing a vehicle, Daniel was usually the first person they called. If a neighbor found themselves stranded on the side of the road, Daniel was often the person who showed up. If a friend needed advice, a favor, or simply someone willing to listen, Daniel rarely said no. That's why what happened later felt so difficult for people to accept. Because Daniel Carter wasn't just known. He was trusted, and trust creates assumptions. People assume trusted people are predictable. They assume trusted people will continue doing what they have always done. They assume tomorrow will look a lot like yesterday. For years, that assumption appeared completely reasonable. Then there was Olivia Carter. To understand this story, it's impossible to separate Daniel from Olivia. Their relationship was one of the strongest connections in Daniel's life. Friends often described them as remarkably close. Even after Olivia became an adult and built a life of her own, She still spoke with her father regularly, sometimes daily, sometimes multiple times a day. They shared inside jokes, family traditions, stories nobody else understood. There was a comfort between them that comes from years of trust and familiarity. Because of that bond, Olivia noticed things others overlooked. Not major things, small things, changes in tone, moments of hesitation, comments that seemed unusual coming from her father. At the time, none of them appeared important. Looking back later, they became impossible to forget. The town itself played a role in why nobody recognized the warning signs. It was the type of community where people felt safe. Children rode bicycles through neighborhoods. Neighbors waved from front porches. Local businesses knew their customers by name. Most residents believed they understood the people around them. And in many cases, they did. That's why serious mysteries felt out of place there. People expected problems to happen somewhere else. Not here. Not to someone like Daniel Carter. But every story looks simple before people know the ending. And hidden inside Daniel's routine were a handful of moments that seemed meaningless at the time. A few comments. A few observations. A few conversations. Nothing dramatic. Nothing alarming. Just unusual enough to be remembered later. Several weeks before his disappearance, Daniel made a comment that struck Olivia as strange. Not frightening. Just unusual. He mentioned that people often overlook things that matter because they're focused on what they expect to see. At the time, Olivia laughed and asked what he meant. Daniel shrugged and changed the subject. The conversation lasted less than a minute. She forgot about it almost immediately. Months later, she would replay that moment repeatedly. Another time, a friend remembered Daniel appearing distracted during a conversation. When asked if something was wrong, he smiled and insisted everything was fine. The answers sounded believable. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? Everyone has difficult days. Everyone gets distracted. Everyone carries concerns they don't discuss openly. Then there were a handful of observations that never seemed connected. Someone remembered Daniel looking over his shoulder more often than usual. Another recalled him ending a conversation abruptly. A third remembered a remark that didn't seem important until much later. Individually, none of these moments stood out. Collectively, they painted a picture nobody recognized at the time. Because human beings naturally dismiss information that lacks context. When events appear unrelated, our minds treat them as unrelated. A strange comment becomes a passing thought. An unusual concern becomes a temporary worry. An odd conversation becomes something forgotten. That's exactly what happened here. Nobody paid attention because nothing seemed connected. Not Olivia Carter. Not Daniel's friends. Not the people who interacted with him every day. And certainly not Detective Samuel Reed, who had no reason to view those moments as evidence. The pieces existed, but the picture didn't. Not yet. The comments remained comments. The concerns remained concerns. The conversations remained forgotten memories. And the voicemail that would eventually change everything was still sitting quietly in the future, waiting for the day people would finally understand what it meant. Because later, those moments would look very different. And once investigators understood how they connected to Daniel Carter's disappearance, it became impossible to see them the same way again. Everything changed on a Monday morning. At first, nobody realized it. The day began like countless others before it. The repair shop opened on schedule. Customers arrived expecting routine service. Employees prepared for another ordinary workday. And Daniel Carter never showed up. Initially, nobody panicked. People who knew Daniel understood that unexpected delays happen. A vehicle breakdown. A family matter. A forgotten appointment. Any number of reasonable explanations could account for his absence. The problem was that Daniel Carter wasn't the type of person who disappeared without calling. Hours passed. Then more hours. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages received no response. Friends assumed he would eventually get back to them. By late afternoon, concern began replacing patience. Something felt wrong. Not because anyone had evidence. Because Daniel's behavior didn't match the man they knew. Day one ended with uncertainty. Nobody imagined they were witnessing the beginning of a mystery that would last for years. Day two brought fear. When Daniel still hadn't returned home, family members began contacting everyone they could think of. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, former colleagues, anyone who might know where he had gone. Nobody did. The answers they received only created more questions. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. No one could explain why he had vanished. That afternoon, Daniel Carter was officially reported missing. The report landed on Detective Samuel Reed's desk alongside dozens of others. At first glance, the circumstances appeared unusual but not alarming enough to point toward a specific conclusion. Adults leave voluntarily every day. People disappear for reasons that later proved surprisingly ordinary. Detective Samuel Reed approached the case carefully, gathering information, while avoiding assumptions. But even in those early hours, one fact stood out. Daniel Carter had left behind nearly everything. His routine, his responsibilities, his relationships. And for those who knew him best, that made very little sense. Day 5 brought a different atmosphere entirely. Search efforts intensified. Volunteers organized community searches. Local businesses posted flyers. Social media filled with photographs and appeals for information. The town that had spent decades knowing Daniel Carter suddenly found itself searching for him. People checked places he might have visited. Investigators retraced known movements. Witnesses came forward with possible sightings. Yet none of it produced answers. The mystery seemed to grow larger with every passing day. That's when investigators discovered the voicemail. At first, the recording didn't appear significant. It had been left shortly before Daniel disappeared. A short message. 23 seconds. Nothing more. Detective Samuel Reed listened to it. Family members listened to it. Friends listened to it. Again and again. The recording seemed ordinary. Daniel's voice sounded calm, controlled, familiar. There was no obvious distress, no direct warning, no dramatic statement that immediately raised alarms. People expected hidden meaning. Instead, they found normal conversation. Or so it seemed. Weeks passed, then months. The voicemail remained part of the investigation, but not its center. Whenever new leads emerged, attention shifted elsewhere. Whenever theories developed, investigators focused on stronger evidence. The recording remained in the background, always present, rarely questioned. Yet Olivia Carter never stopped thinking about it. Unlike everyone else, she continued returning to the message. Listening, replaying, listening again. Not because she believed it contained an answer, because it was one of the last remaining connections she had to her father. She knew Daniel's voice better than almost anyone. She knew his habits, his speech patterns, the way he paused before certain words, the way he emphasized certain thoughts. If something was wrong, she believed she would eventually hear it. For a long time, she heard nothing unusual. Then one evening, everything changed. Not because of what Daniel said, not because of how he said it, because of something hiding behind the words. A sound, a faint sound, so faint that most people would never notice it. The kind of detail your brain naturally filters out while focusing on a conversation. Olivia almost missed it herself. At first, she wasn't even certain it mattered. She replayed the recording again and again, each time focusing less on Daniel's voice and more on what existed around it. The background, the noise, the details nobody had paid attention to. Suddenly, something felt different. Something felt wrong. Not obvious, not dramatic, just unusual enough to refuse being ignored. When Olivia shared her observation with Detective Samuel Reed, the reaction was cautious. After all, investigations generate countless theories. Most lead nowhere. But this one was different. Because the more investigators examined the recording, the more questions emerged. Questions nobody had asked before. Questions capable of changing the entire direction of the case. And suddenly, the voicemail everyone thought they understood became the most important piece of evidence. The moment Olivia Carter pointed investigators toward the background sound, the entire investigation changed direction. Until then, Detective Samuel Reed and his team had been searching outward. They were looking for witnesses, locations, movements, physical evidence, possible explanations for why Daniel Carter disappeared. Now, for the first time, they began looking backward. Back toward evidence they believed they already understood. Back toward details they had heard but never truly examined. The voicemail was pulled from the case file and reviewed again. Then again, and again. Audio specialists were consulted. Investigators listened through headphones. They slowed the recording down, removed background interference, enhanced frequencies, separated layers of sound. Every second of the 23-second message was examined more carefully than ever before. The process revealed something unsettling. The recording contained far more information than anyone initially realized. For months, people had focused entirely on Daniel's words. Nobody paid attention to what existed around those words. And that was the mistake. The answer wasn't hidden. It was overlooked. As investigators revisited the case, other overlooked details began surfacing as well. A witness who originally believed their observation was unimportant contacted authorities again. The second interview revealed information that suddenly aligned with the voicemail timeline. Another resident remembered seeing something unusual near a location connected to the investigation. Months earlier, they dismissed it as meaningless. Now it seemed relevant. A third witness recalled a brief interaction that had felt ordinary at the time, but appeared different when viewed through the lens of newly discovered evidence. Individually, these details seemed small. Together, they began forming a pattern. Detective Samuel Reed noticed something else. The more investigators learned, the more certain assumptions started falling apart. Timelines that once appeared accurate no longer fit. Witness accounts that seemed unrelated suddenly overlapped. Locations previously dismissed as unimportant began attracting attention. The investigation wasn't becoming simpler. It was becoming clearer. And clarity can sometimes be more unsettling than confusion, because every new answer seemed to reveal another question. Meanwhile, media coverage continued growing. What had started as a local missing person story slowly attracted wider attention. News outlets revisited Daniel Carter's disappearance. Online communities analyzed available information. People debated theories. Speculation spread. Everyone wanted answers. Very few people had them. Residents who had known Daniel for years struggled to understand how a man so familiar could seemingly vanish without explanation. The case became a frequent topic of conversation throughout the community. At restaurants, at gas stations, at church gatherings, at local sporting events. People discussed the mystery as though solving it collectively might somehow bring Daniel home. Yet despite the attention, one thing remained constant. The voicemail. Everything kept leading back to those same 23 seconds. No matter how many leads investigators pursued, the recording remained at the center of the mystery. Detective Samuel Reed eventually described it as a puzzle hidden inside another puzzle. The voicemail wasn't merely evidence anymore. It had become the key. Investigators now believe the background sound Olivia Carter noticed might reveal where Daniel had been during his final known moments. And if they could identify that location, they might finally understand what happened next. The challenge was that nobody recognized the sound. At least not initially. Experts examined it. Investigators debated it. Witnesses listened to it. People offered theories. Some believed it was machinery. Others thought it was traffic. A few suggested environmental noise. None of the explanations fit perfectly. Days turned into weeks as specialists continued analyzing the recording. The sound remained frustratingly familiar. Not distinctive enough to identify immediately, yet not ordinary enough to ignore. Then a breakthrough arrived from an unexpected source. Someone heard the recording and recognized something investigators had missed. Something incredibly specific. Something connected to a place that had barely received attention during the investigation. When Detective Samuel Reed received that information, he immediately understood its significance. Because if the identification was correct, it changed everything. The location, the timeline, the assumptions, the entire case. For the first time since Daniel Carter disappeared, investigators believed they were finally moving toward the truth. And then investigators identified the sound nobody recognized. The moment they did, the mystery that had puzzled an entire community began revealing its secrets. The breakthrough came from a detail so small that most people would have dismissed it immediately. After months of analysis, audio experts finally succeeded in isolating the background noise hidden beneath Daniel Carter's voice. For years, investigators had focused on what Daniel was saying. Now they were focused on where he was saying it. The distinction changed everything. Once the distracting layers of audio were removed, a clearer sound emerged. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't the kind of sound people associate with solving mysteries. In fact, it was something remarkably ordinary. A repeating mechanical signal combined with a distinctive environmental noise that occurred at specific intervals. The sound was familiar to someone who worked nearby. When that individual heard the enhanced recording, recognition was immediate. They had heard it before, many times. The sound wasn't random. It originated from a location investigators had barely considered during the early stages of the case. Suddenly, Detective Samuel Reed had something the investigation had lacked for years: direction. The moment the location was identified, his team began reconstructing the timeline from the beginning. Every witness statement was re-examined. Every reported sighting was re-evaluated. Every known movement connected to Daniel Carter was placed back onto the timeline. This time, something remarkable happened. The pieces fit. Events that once appeared disconnected suddenly aligned. Witness accounts that seemed contradictory began supporting one another. Small observations people had forgotten became meaningful. The mystery that once felt impossible to understand started revealing a coherent sequence of events. Then more witnesses came forward. Not because new evidence suddenly appeared, because the new timeline triggered old memories. One person remembered seeing Daniel near the identified location. Another recalled an interaction they had previously considered insignificant. A third remembered hearing a detail that suddenly made sense. Each account strengthened the reconstruction. Each memory added another piece to the puzzle. Detective Samuel Reed realized something that sent a chill through everyone involved in the investigation. The answer had been available from the beginning. Not entirely, but enough of it. Enough to point investigators toward the truth if they had known where to look. The clue had been present from the very beginning. It was hiding behind the words. The voicemail that people treated as an ordinary message was never ordinary. Its significance had simply been misunderstood. Everything changed once investigators stopped listening to Daniel's words and started listening to everything surrounding them. The hidden truth wasn't contained in a confession. It wasn't a coded message. It wasn't a secret phrase waiting to be deciphered. It was context. The kind of context people naturally ignore while focusing on the speaker. And yet that context became the key to understanding Daniel Carter's final known moments. As the investigation moved toward its conclusion, the emotional impact spread throughout the community. Families who had followed the case for years reacted with disbelief. Friends struggled to accept how close the answer had always been. People who had listened to the voicemail dozens of times found themselves replaying it again, hearing it differently now that they understood what mattered. No one felt that realization more deeply than Olivia Carter. For years, she had carried unanswered questions. For years, she wondered whether there was something she had missed, something she should have noticed, something that could have helped bring answers sooner. Now, as Detective Samuel Reed explained the significance of the background sound and how it connected to the reconstructed timeline, Olivia finally understood. The recording her father left behind was never meaningless. The final message wasn't empty. It wasn't incomplete. It wasn't useless evidence sitting in a forgotten file. It was a clue, a real clue, a clue that had survived every passing year, a clue that had waited patiently for someone to recognize it. The realization brought both comfort and heartbreak. Comfort because the mystery finally made sense. Heartbreak because the answer had been so close all along. In that moment, Olivia understood something that would stay with her forever. The answer had been waiting inside the voicemail all along. Not hidden, not buried, simply unheard. And once the truth emerged, those 23 seconds would never sound the same again. In the end, the story returns to where it began. A voicemail, 23 seconds. A message that sounded ordinary. A recording that people listened to countless times without realizing it contained the answer they were searching for. When investigators finally solved the mystery surrounding Daniel Carter's disappearance, many people expected a dramatic revelation. They expected a shocking confession, a hidden document, a secret witness, something extraordinary. Instead, they found something much simpler. A sound, a small detail hiding quietly behind a familiar voice. And somehow, that made the story even more powerful, because it forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality. The truth had never been completely out of reach. It had always been there, waiting, patiently. Inside a recording everyone believed they already understood. Sometimes the most important things aren't what people say. Sometimes they're what we fail to hear. For Olivia Carter, that realization carried a weight that is difficult to describe. For years, she searched for answers. For years, she replayed memories, revisited conversations, and wondered whether she had missed something important. The discovery inside the voicemail didn't erase the pain of losing her father. It didn't undo the years of uncertainty, but it provided something she had been searching for almost as desperately as Daniel himself. Understanding, a way to make sense of what happened, a way to finally connect the pieces, and perhaps most importantly, a reminder that her father had unknowingly left behind one final clue, one final piece of himself, one final chance for the truth to be found. Detective Samuel Reed found himself reflecting on a different lesson. After years of investigating cases, he understood better than most people how easily the human mind can overlook important details. Not because people are careless, because people focus on what they expect to find. When investigators first listened to Daniel Carter's voicemail, they focused on the words. That seemed logical. Words are where meaning usually lives. But this case proved that meaning sometimes exists somewhere else. Sometimes answers hide in the background. Sometimes the details we dismiss become the details that matter most. And sometimes a mystery survives not because evidence is missing, but because evidence is misunderstood. Looking back, the entire case feels almost impossible. How could so many people hear the same recording and miss the same clue? How could the answer remain hidden for so long? The answer is surprisingly simple. Because nobody knew what they were listening for. And that truth extends far beyond this story. Every day, people overlook small details, small moments, small observations, small clues that seem insignificant until time reveals their importance. Most disappear forever. A few change everything. Daniel Carter's voicemail became one of those rare moments. A reminder that ordinary things are not always ordinary. A reminder that the answers we search for are sometimes much closer than we realize. And a reminder that understanding often arrives long after the evidence itself. The stories that stay with us aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they're the quiet ones. The ones hiding in plain sight. The ones waiting patiently in the background while everyone looks somewhere else. The ones we only understand when it's too late. And perhaps that's why this story remains unforgettable. Not because of what happened, but because of how close the answer was all along. 23 seconds. One voicemail, one overlooked sound, and a truth that changed everything. So here's the question. If you had listened to Daniel Carter's voicemail for the very first time, would you have noticed the clue? Would your attention have drifted beyond the words? Would you have focused on the faint sound hidden in the background? Would you have recognized that something important was hiding inside those 23 seconds? Or would you have done exactly what almost everyone else did? Would you have listened to the message, heard nothing unusual, and moved on? It's a difficult question to answer, because now that you know the story, the clue feels obvious. The sound feels important. The connection feels clear. But remember, Olivia Carter heard the same voicemail. Detective Samuel Reed heard the same voicemail. Friends, family members, investigators, and experts all heard the same recording. And for years, nobody understood what they were hearing. That's what makes this story so powerful. Not that the clue was impossible to find, but that it was hiding in a place everyone thought they already understood. Sometimes the answers we search for aren't hidden behind locked doors. Sometimes they aren't buried in forgotten evidence. Sometimes they're sitting right in front of us, waiting for us to pay attention, waiting for us to listen a little closer, waiting for us to ask one more question. So let me know what you think in the comments below. If you were Olivia Carter, would you have kept listening until you found the clue? If you were Detective Samuel Reed, would you have recognized its importance sooner? Or would you have missed it just like everyone else? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy mysteries where one overlooked detail changes everything, where ordinary moments hide extraordinary truths, and where the ending completely transforms the way you see the beginning, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Because if you think this story will stay with you forever, wait until you hear about the woman who solved a 20-year mystery after finding a note hidden inside an old library book. For 2 decades, investigators believed the case had reached a dead end. Witnesses disappeared. Memories faded. Evidence dried up. The mystery slowly became part of local history. Then one rainy afternoon, a woman borrowed an old library book that hadn't been checked out in years. Inside its pages was a handwritten note. A note that should never have been there. A note connected to a mystery nobody believed could still be solved. And what investigators discovered after that would reopen a case everyone thought was finished forever. Trust me, that's a story you won't want to miss. Until next time, remember this. Sometimes the biggest answers don't arrive with warning signs. Sometimes they're hidden inside ordinary things. A photograph, a receipt, a forgotten note, or in Daniel Carter's case, a 23-second voicemail that changed everything.